Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, and everyone, welcome to the 769th meeting of the Economic Club of New York. In case you missed it, we recently had the 768th, and that got a bit of attention, so it's nice to be here at the 769th also, and welcome to all of you, and thank you for coming. My name is Bob Steele, and I'm fortunate enough to be the chair of the club, but also work at Perella Weinberg Partners, and we thank all of you for being here today for our latest in the author series of presentations that the club is really excited to present. We're recognized and proud to be seen as a preeminent forum for discussion, and our club for more than a century has hosted 1,000 preeminent guests who spoke about important issues. We also want to thank, as we always do, the students who are joining us virtually today from the Gabelli School of Business at Fordham, NYU Stern School, and also the Graduate Center. As member of also the members of our largest class ever of fellows, the 2024 group, we're excited that they're here. Now let's get on with the show. It's really a pleasure for me to welcome back our guest today. He's so well known. He's been to the club before, and to have him back is really an honor. Secretary and author Wilbur Ross. Wilbur served as Secretary of Commerce under President Trump after a distinguished career in financial services and investment banking and private equity. He advised the president on key economic and trade issues, and really thought continually and gave great advice on how to support businesses and grow our economy, which was a fundamental plank of President Trump's plans. Originally from North Bergen, New Jersey, Secretary Ross spent much of his career at Rothschild's, where he negotiated several major bankruptcy cases and became known as one of the preeminent people that understood and developed the whole bankruptcy industry, and led into his career in investing as his own private equity firm worked hard to provide capital and help companies turn around in important industries that are fundamental to our economy, things such as steel, coal, and banking. He's restructured over $400 billion of assets, earning a special reputation on Wall Street. In 2011, Bloomberg Markets named him one of the 50 most influential figures in global finance. Wilbur's also a noted philanthropist, supporting organizations such as Japan Society and Brookings, and also various fine arts institutions. Secretary Ross is a graduate of Yale University and Harvard Business School, and he's just released his latest book this week called Risk and Returns, Creating Success in Business and Life. And this explores his experiences as he steered through all the things I've described. The format today is we're quite excited that Secretary Ross will have a conversation with an esteemed member of our club, John Paulson, who's the founder of Paulson and Company, and he'll serve as the moderator for the conversation. Let me remind everyone the conversation is on the record, and we'll plan to take a few questions at the end, and then I'll come back to close the lunch. So thanks everybody again for being here. Thank you, Secretary Ross, and thank you, John. Gentlemen, over to you.
Thank you, Bob. It's an honor for me to be here today with the Economic Club, and also to be interviewing Wilbur Ross. Bob gave a pretty good background of Wilbur, so I think we could start right with the interview. Let me just say, I did read the book. Wilbur was kind enough to give me an advance copy, and I found it extremely interesting. It's a great history of Wall Street, great stories about Wilbur's personal life as well as business life, and I found it quite riveting. So I think you'll all enjoy reading it. But let's start at the beginning. Wilbur, tell us a little bit about your upbringing.
Well, I grew up in a town called North Bergen, New Jersey, about halfway between George Washington Bridge and the Lincoln Tunnel. And my mom was a third grade school teacher at the public school I attended. My dad was a little local lawyer, and they were both very active in the Democratic Party. In those days in Hudson County, with Mayor Haig being the leader, that was the only party that functioned. So it was all I knew when I was growing up. So that was the very early part. I was a scrawny kid and a bookworm, so I was an ideal candidate to be a victim for bullies. And that changed after a little bit. My dad got me a punching bag and a few lessons, and while I didn't have to use it too much, knowing that you knew how to defend yourself gave you an air of confidence that kind of made the bullies keep away anyhow. And I think that's a lesson we should carry forward, not just to adult life, but to geopolitics. I think begging potential aggressors to be kind to you, begging to make deals with them, begging, and not responding forcefully is a huge mistake and could very well lead to a very bad outcome.
Interesting. Tell us about your experience at Yale, how you got into Yale, and then afterwards at Harvard Business School.
Sure. Well, at Yale, I really wanted to be a fiction writer. And in second year, they had a very tough course called Daily Themes. You had to put in 1,000 words of fiction every morning by 10 o'clock into a little slot. Well, by the end of the second week, I was out of material, so I quit the course and went to Wall Street instead. So you could say this book, which is the only book I've written, is really 60 some odd years in work in progress, but it's factual, not fictional. So that was Yale, and Yale was what got me started into Wall Street. Faculty advisor of mine left the university's portfolio, joined a boutique investment firm, and I loved it. I was there as a summer trainee, and then had a very formative experience between Yale and Harvard Business School. Went directly to the business school from undergraduate, which was at least then unusual. First day online at registration, person in front of me, it was dressed very differently from the way I was. I was dressed like a usual undergraduate, chinos, a Shetland sweater, button-down shirt. This guy was in a three-piece suit with a little gold chain, wearing fancy Gucci loafers and carrying a briefcase with his initials on it in gold letters. And I thought, wow, this is going to be the competition here. But I thought about it and concluded it's good, because I can probably learn more from him than he's ever going to learn from me with such a limited experience basis. So at the business school, the most formative experience and the first real mentor that I ever had was a professor called George Doriot, a Frenchman. He had served as a private in the French army in World War I, and in the World War II became a general in the American Army, and in between was a professor at HBS and a founder of IMIDA, the big business school in Europe. So he took me under his wing and gave me advice on everything. A couple of the little tidbits that you might find amusing. He said, never use a PowerPoint when you're speaking. I said, but why? I think it's a nice visual thing. It keeps you on track. He said, no, the problem with it is it's bad enough if you say something dumb to a big audience, but to say it by reading it from a thing you were hanging up, that's really dumb. So don't do it. He also hated speeches that were long. He felt if you knew what you were talking about, it should be fairly brief. And he also had some tips on dressing. He said, you got to stop wearing these little kid clothes like you're wearing. You must start to dress like the successful person you intend to become. So that was a funny kind of advice. But he was also very good with
I may
advice.
just interrupt. So I gave that same advice to my colleagues at my firm today. I said, when you show up today, wear a suit and tie. And they all did. And
Wow.
I will say, it's the first time in 20 years I've ever seen them with a suit and tie. So you look pretty good. It's good advice. Wilbur got the same advice.
Well, that just shows John's power to make people dress properly. Did you just rent the suits, or are you actually owning them?
Tell us, after Harvard, how did you start your career in finance? Which were the first firms you worked with, and what ultimately led you to
Yeah, well, that was
distress?
quite a story. I was hired out of the business school by a go-go money manager called Imre DeVay. Had a very, very good track record, mostly dealing in lower quality securities. And he hired me, but because I had been in ROTC at Yale, I had to get a deferment to go to business school directly. So he agreed to delay my joining the firm for what was meant to be 6 months active duty and 7.5 years reserve. Well, it turned out to be longer. It turned out to be 1.5 years because of the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Berlin airlift. So I involuntarily spent a good deal more time in the military than I meant to. But that was also an interesting experience in two regards. First, the officers' club at Fort Dix, which is where I was stationed, had a rule. You had to go in dress blue uniform every Wednesday night and play bingo at the officers' club, with the funds going to the benefit of the officers' wives' club. Well, we young lieutenants all hated it. We hated we were in for extra year. We hated having to get all dressed up to play bingo. So one of the lieutenants figured out there were many more lieutenants than there were senior officers. So he staged a very undercover proxy fight, took control of the officers' club board, and immediately canceled the bingo. Within 1 week of that, he was deported to Greenland, to Thule, Greenland. One of the other rebels was sent to chemical and biological radiological warfare school. They just dispersed them all. And of course, the new board's first act was putting bingo back in. Well, what that taught me was, if you're going to screw around with a really big, powerful institution like the military, you better think through what might be the unintended consequences, because the law of unintended consequences is brutal and universal. And so that was a kind of worthwhile lesson. So now I get out of the military, and the week before I show up for work at my new employer, he died. And on his deathbed, he sold the firm to one of his clients, Robert Winthrop from Massachusetts, very wealthy man. So I changed jobs before I even got my first paycheck, just because my employer-to-be died. 2 or 3 weeks later, in came one of our main accounts for lunch. It was the Campbell Soup Pension Fund and Jack Dorrance, who then was the main shareholder and CEO of Campbell Soup. So we're having a nice lunch, and toward the end of it, he turns to Mr. Winthrop and said, "Bob, I notice our accounts have a lot of Lucky Friday silver mines in them. Why is that?" So Mr. Winthrop turned to me and he said, "Wilbur, do my accounts have a lot of Lucky Friday silver mine too?" Well, obviously they did, because you can't be selective with people's accounts. So I said, "Yes, sir, they do," and explained why. Winthrop said, "Well, thank you. I had a very nice lunch." 2 days later, they pulled the whole amount of money out, not because of Lucky Friday, but because it was obvious that the new owner was not a professional investor, was not into the details, and perhaps couldn't make the performance that Emery had made. Well, that's a big problem. Now you have an owner who's been embarrassed. So he went to a Citibank board meeting the following week. This when Dick Perkins was the CEO of Citibank, and he explained this mistake he had made buying DeVay. Perkins said, well, I have a solution. There's a nice old line Wall Street firm called Wood Struthers, and Sam Milbank is their senior partner and their major capital source. He wants to retire. If you would just take a few million more dollars, buy him out, they'll call it Wood Struthers and Winthrop, and nobody will ever again bother you. Well, now I changed, and so they did. 2 weeks later, it became Wood Struthers and Winthrop. So now I've changed jobs for the second time, this time to people I had never interviewed with, never had any intention of working for, but at least in between I'd gotten a paycheck or two, so it was better than the first change. Well, they were indeed a conservative firm, so the first thing they did was shut down the venture capital fund that had been at DeVay. It was called DeVay International Corp. They fired everybody at it, made me an officer of it. In retrospect, I think the reason they gave me that task was I was the newest and most expendable person, so it wasn't particularly complimentary. But anyhow, they said, if in 2 years you can get us out of this without having to put in any more capital, without any bad press, and without any litigation, then we'll give you a big bonus. Well, that was great. And that's how I first encountered distressed companies, because about half the portfolio was pretty good. It was high-tech things, and we sold one for a very big price to Control Data, but some of the others were a real mess. So that's how I started to learn about distressed companies.
And after that 2 years, then what? Did you get the bonus?
Yes, I got the bonus. I got it a little earlier than the 2 years because we actually closed it out a little earlier. But then they wanted me to go back and just be an analyst. Well, now I had had a taste of something a little more exotic. And so I called my friend Dave Williams, who was a classmate of mine at HBS, who had left, his military was long ago. So by then he was the research director at Waddell & Reed, big mutual fund. He introduced me to a firm called Faulkner, Dawkins & Sullivan, one of the early, very good research boutiques. And so I was there, ran their investment banking, and then when the SEC put in negotiated commissions, we went from a business that was carrying half a gross to pre-tax net and earning 100% on equity to a very moderate rate of return. So that's when I joined Rothschild. They had been clients of mine before, so that was how that got started.
Now at Rothschild, you ran the, I guess, the bankruptcy practice.
Yes.
For a long period of time. You were at Rothschild for 25 years.
Yes.
And there you were the preeminent advisor in restructuring bankrupt companies. I believe I saw a statistic, about 30% of the largest bankruptcies in America over your course. Could you talk about some of the major deals that you worked on?
Sure. Well, the most timely and interesting one was the bankruptcy of the Trump Taj Mahal. That's in fact how I met Donald Trump. It was a very unusual situation in that he had convinced Merrill Lynch and Bear Stearns to underwrite $800 million of first mortgage bonds for a startup casino in Atlantic City, the Taj Mahal. But these bonds never paid one coupon. As you know, normally every 6 months there's a coupon. Well, this bond never paid a coupon, didn't pay the first coupon. So the bondholders were naturally quite upset with that. So to kind of punish him, they hired me to go after him. They hired me the Thursday of preceding Labor Day weekend, and he immediately called up, said, "You have to come down to Atlantic City tomorrow. We'll start the discussions." The last damn thing I wanted to do was to be in Atlantic City on Labor Day weekend with a bunch of people getting off buses to play slot machines. I wanted to be in Southampton, but I felt it being a new assignment, I really had to go down and do it. So I go to the 63rd Street heliport, and it wasn't hard to find his helicopter. It had on the side in 6-foot-high nail-polished red letters, TRUMP, one of his many gestures at understatement. And so 35 or so minutes later, we land in Atlantic City. Boardwalk is teeming with people, and Donald is there in this big stretch limo to take us to the casino, which was only about 200 feet away from the helipad. But part of the showmanship was this big car. As I got into the car, I noticed there were 2 flags on the front bumper. One was a US flag, the other was a Trump flag. And the Trump flag was a little bit bigger than the US flag. So that was another gesture, another showmanship kind of a thing. So we go inside the casino, and again, it just pours hordes of people. He gives me a nice tour of the casino, and people are having him sign their notepads, sign their beanie cap. One lady was there in a bareback dress. She had him sign her back. Now, what she was going to do with Donald J. Trump in magic marker black on her back, I have no earthly idea. But anyhow, he did it, and she seemed very happy with it. So we start what he kept calling discussions. He never referred to them as negotiations. And the reason why became pretty clear. He started out by saying, as you know, the bonds are trading at 20 cents on the dollar, and you'll be lucky to get 20 cents out of this, but we can save a lot of time. I'll guarantee you 20 cents. We'll just quit discussions right now, and everything will be fine. I said, well, Donald, there's only one problem. Bondholders are expecting me to get them par plus accrued plus the majority of the stock in your casino. And so we didn't get off to a very good start. And after a couple hours of bickering back and forth, I found he was still at 20 cents. I said, well, Donald, is that it? That's as far as you're going today? He said, yes, and you'll be lucky to get 20 cents. I said, well, if that's all you have to say, I'm leaving. I'm going back to New York. I'll see you next week sometime. And he was stunned, because that was the kind of tactic that he liked to use on other people. So it shocked him a bit to have someone walk out on him. And to this day, he tells the story. Most recently, he told it at my 85th birthday party. So it isn't something he's embarrassed about. He was intrigued by it. But something else was interesting about that bankruptcy. After the bonds collapsed, Carl Icahn became the big bondholder. And Carl and I have been friends for quite a long time. So Carl and I were together fighting with Trump in the bankruptcy. But as we emerged from the bankruptcy, we both ended up being early supporters of him when he ran for president in 2016. And that may seem very, very strange, but when you're facing an adversary in these dire circumstances of a bankruptcy, you get to know what they're made of. And we both concluded that he was made of some pretty good stuff. And that was why we were both early endorsers. So it's a weird way to meet the future president, weird way to begin.
And let me ask you, he started at 20 cents, and just let's fast forward, where do you ultimately settle?
Well, we got par plus accrued. But I had figured out that his breaking point probably wasn't the debt part. I figured out his breaking point was probably not giving up control of the equity. So we finally yielded and gave him 51% of the equity, or let him keep 51. We took 49, but it had an outside board. It had a lot of constraints on what he could do.
Well, that explains why Wilbur was the preeminent bankruptcy advisor. He was hired by the bondholders when the bonds were 20. The debtor tried to squeeze him out at 20, but he ultimately got par plus accrued for his clients. So,
but the end of that story was even more dramatic than my first meeting with him. Here's how it ended. We were having very public bickering that was in the press all the time because he likes to use the press to put pressure on people. And so he was saying I was insane, the bondholder should fire me, all sorts of lovey-dovey things like that. And it kept going and going. Meanwhile, we were inching up toward the par. Finally, we were very, very close to it. But one morning I went over to see him with what I called our best and final offer, which he promptly rejected. That was we were still at 51% that we wanted. So I said, well, Donald, we're going to see you in court if we can't close this last gap. So I went back to my office, put out a press release saying that at 5 o'clock that afternoon, the bondholder committee was going to hold a very important press conference at the Marriott Marquis Hotel. And the reason we picked the Marriott was it was not one of his hotels, so it was a little spiteful thing that we did. So but we didn't say what the press conference would say, just that it would be important. As soon as it hit the newswire, he calls me. He said, what the hell is this? What are you doing? Press conference, Marriott Marquis. I said, well, Donald, I told you, since we didn't agree, we're going to put you in bankruptcy tomorrow morning. And that's what this press conference is all about, because we haven't closed the gap. So he said, well, let me get with my advisors a bit. Came back, made a few technical changes. We went to the 51-49. And then he said, but one more thing. And I had gotten to know him well enough to know one more thing usually meant something that was one great big thing. He said, one more thing. You got to cancel the thing at the Marriott Marquis and hold it at the Plaza Hotel. The Plaza had been one of his hotels. So we get over there, enormous amount of press, big coverage, blah, 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 blah. Press conference lasts a better part of an hour. And by now I'm pretty worn out. This has been quite a thrilling day. And so I get in the car to be driven home, and the phone rings. This is your mother, in just about those tones. And I said, oh, hi, Mom, how are you? And she said, not good. I said, well, what's the matter? And she said, well, I've been playing mahjong with my friends, my lady friends, and they and I all agree, after all those mean things he said about you, should never have made a deal with them. I said, but Mom, that's what I got hired to do. That's what I do. And she said, well, if you had only become a lawyer like I always wanted you to, you wouldn't have to hang around with people like that. And she hung up on me.
Well,
eventually she forgave me, but.
Let me ask you, as an aside, there was a rumor on Wall Street that if you were invited for lunch at Rothschild, you were served Chateau Lafite.
Oh, yes, vintage years.
So was that true?
Yes, it was true. What was also true was that they charged us, it actually came from the vineyard in France, they charged us more than the retail price as a transfer price because it was a way to get money back over to where they were, pre-tax. But the wine at Rothschild led to another story. At a point in time, the family was thinking about, and eventually did, put a vineyard into California. They did Opus One with the Mondavis, a very good vineyard. So before they made the decision, when they were just starting to think about it, I was over there scouting around for them. So I stay at one vineyard that was for sale. We have several gallons of nice red wine at dinner. And then I had wanted to see the whole process. So first thing the next morning, 4 o'clock, we got up to watch them put seedlings in. Most backbreaking job you can imagine. Mexicans hunched over with a big green satchel over their neck in which were little seedlings. And they were preceded through the field by a big tractor pulling a device that drilled holes at precise intervals so that they could be ready for mechanical harvesting. So these guys are hunched over in what was hot sun, even at 4 in the morning, planting these seedlings, a backbreaking job that you couldn't imagine. Anyhow, around 4:30, suddenly a helicopter lands, not Trump's, but just a government helicopter, and trucks come from 4 different directions. It was the Immigration Service. They came to inspect all the workers, and they arrested all of them, and were preparing to deport them. Meanwhile, I'm standing there holding my New York driver's license saying, I don't even speak Spanish, leave me alone. So they didn't take me away, but they took all the workforce. So I said to the vintner after they left, well, now I understand why you want to sell this. This is a hell of a problem. They take your whole workforce. Does this happen often? He said, yes, about once a month. And he said, but it's not a problem. I said, not a problem? How can this not be a problem? He said, well, remember that tractor driver, the tractor you admired so much? That's his day job. His night job is he's a bus driver. And the Immigration Service always takes the workers to Tijuana. So they line up at the bus station. He picks them back up. They'll be here at 4 o'clock tomorrow morning to work. So I thought, this is incredible. So I stayed over, and sure enough, they were all there actually a little before 4. It was my first real exposure to the way immigration works.
Okay. Let me just ask you, after Rothschild, 25 years, you formed Wilbur Ross & Co., private equity specializing in bankruptcy investing. I think the deal you're best known for is the roll-up of the steel industry, starting with LTV, which was in bankruptcy, and then creating International Steel, which you sold to what became ArcelorMittal. Let me ask you, so people understand, what was the investing strategy? What did you invest into, the original bankruptcy in LTV, and when you sold it to Mattel, what did you realize from that investment?
Well, before we started the fund, I started the fund actually while I was at Rothschild. It was called Rothschild Recovery Fund. And the reason I went off on my own was they brought in a new CEO that I was totally incompatible with. So we worked it out. I had decided that the private equity business was a better business than the advisory business. And so I had decided I didn't want to keep doing both. I was doing the global restructuring for the Rothschild Group and running this then small fund. So I worked out a deal with them where I wouldn't keep competing with them for advisory clients, but they would sell me the fund. And we had a little negotiation about that because I wanted to buy it at their original cost, not at the appreciated cost. And that's what finally happened. But anyhow, so we got to the steel industry because we had advised the unsecured creditors in LTV's first bankruptcy. This was their second, and as it turned out, final bankruptcy. So I knew the steel company that they had, and I knew all of LTV pretty well. And it was horrifying to me that all the recommendations that we made, what they should do post-bankruptcy, they didn't do a single thing. They didn't change anything. They just converted some debt to equity and ran it in the same bad way that they had. So this time when it went bankrupt, the mills were put on what's called hot idle, namely a little bit of molten steel going through the process so that the refractory bricks didn't implode. Because if they did implode, it would be a monumental task to rebuild it. So the creditors were spending $1 million a week to keep it on hot idle. So they put it up for sale. And I figured that we could get it cheaply enough, but we had to solve the problem of the union agreement because they had very tough labor contract. Everybody on the premises was a steel worker. Even if you were a clerk, even if you were the little old person who cleaned the latrine, everybody had to be a card-carrying steel worker. So that made it pretty expensive. And they had 32 job classifications. Job classifications were very, very specific. You could only pick up a red shovel. He could only pick up a white shovel. They were practically that tough. So I went out to see Leo Gerard, who was then the head of the steelworkers, and said, Leo, we'll buy it. We'll put up the capital. We'll start the mills again and hire back some of the workers that had been laid off because it was a big facility. We worked it out, so we went from 32 job classifications to 5, and the only people who were hard carrying were the people who had something to do with steel. We didn't disturb wages at all. We redefined overtime a little bit to make it a little less restrictive. And the quid pro quo was agreed to give productivity bonuses to all the workers. I'm a big believer in productivity bonuses for blue-collar workers, not piecework, not requiring them to do, but if they can hit a target, they get a bonus regardless whether the company's making money or not. He was a little skeptical of that part, saying, oh, you're never really going to pay it. Anyhow, we worked it out, and we made the deal at an Italian restaurant on a big hill overlooking Pittsburgh, and we wrote it out on a series of napkins. So that was my official deal with the steel workers,
and
was on these napkins. So then comes the bid.
Yeah.
And in the bidding, we ended up paying $90 million for assets in which they had invested $2.5 billion in the prior 5 years. So we didn't have very much capital cost. And then we bought $1 billion of receivables and inventory for half that. So we had a very low cost base, and it worked out fine.
Ultimately, you consolidated others and other steel companies, and when you sold it to Mattel, what was the company sold for?
Oh, it was around $5 billion.
$5 billion. So that gives you an example of the attraction of bankruptcy. You buy it distressed, you restructure the costs, you grow the earnings, merge it with someone else, and then he sold it to Mattel for about $5 million. We have only about, I think, 10 minutes left. But let me just ask you one question, and then I want to open it up to the audience. And maybe Uh, You also discuss in the book your love of art, and you've been a collector for most of your life, but over the past 15 years, more or less, you pivoted to collecting Magritte, and
Right.
now have amassed one of probably the largest collection of Magritte in the world. And based on recent prices, a recent Magritte painting sold for $79.8 million at Christie's earlier this year. Your collection of Magritte may turn out to be your greatest investment that you've made. Tell us about your experience with art and Magritte in particular.
Well, I think if you've been making your living out of bankruptcies, surrealism is a natural add-on. So it seemed conceptually like a good thing. But the way we really got going with it was just as Hillary and I were getting serious together and getting ready to get married, we were over in London, and at Christie's in June had a big surrealist sale, of which 6 were Magrittes. We got there one Friday afternoon, and we were kind of transfixed by the sight of these works, because they drew you into them. There's always something a little unusual in it, something out of place. And so it makes you think about what's going on here, what is this all about? And that was his purpose in doing it. But we were clearly very intrigued. The auction house didn't know us from Adam, so wasn't that. But the head of surrealism saw we were interested. So he said, it's almost closing time. If you wait till the gallery shuts down, I'll put those paintings in my office and we can spend an hour or two discussing them. Well, that was great. So we did. And he was very good at educating us. He then said, in what in retrospect was a masterful soft sell, he said, now, if you're going to be interested in Magritte, what you must do is go around the corner to Sims Reed, the bookseller. He has the catalog raisonné. Read it over the weekend, and if you still think you're interested, come back Monday and we'll talk about which one you think you'll buy. So very low-key sales pitch, and it worked. Quite a few of the ones we bought from him.
And today, could you tell us how big your collection is? How many Magrittes you
We
have?
have 38 Magritte.
38. Wow, that's substantial. I know we have a few minutes left. Perhaps we can open it up to questions from the audience.
Will you repeat the questions?
Yeah, sure. Well, he's got a microphone.
Yeah, I've got a microphone. You can hear me. First of all, thank you very much for your service. Start there. Second of all, you were Secretary of Commerce under President Trump. And one of the big things you helped him with were the tariffs and how he talked about tariffs. Could you talk about what you think today on the tariffs and Trump's current plan and how you view it?
Sure. It may surprise you, but I think there won't be a huge difference in the approach to tariffs, whichever of the two wins the presidential election. Gina Raimondo, who was my successor, and who's actually someone I've known for a very long time, has pretty much followed our policies from before. And therefore, assuming that Harris doesn't change what Biden has been doing in tariffs, directionally, they will be tough. They'll be tough on China. They'll be tough on some other people. Whether the exact mechanisms will be similar, maybe there's a difference there. But I think President Trump occasionally speaks in what you could call metaphors. And when he talks about a huge blanket tariff on everything coming into the country, I think that's really his way of simplifying for voters his message. Message being, I'm going to be even tougher on these other countries. So I wouldn't take necessarily too literally what he says. But the same naysayers who, when we put in the steel and aluminum tariffs and tariffs on other products, they always say, oh, the sky is falling. there'll be terrible inflation. It wasn't true. During the Trump period, we had very low unemployment, and we had very little inflation. It was not a problem. And I think he'll be careful enough about it not to make it a problem. But there's a lot of wrong thinking about what are the implications of tariffs. First of all, if we put a big tariff, say, on goods coming from China, chances are the Chinese government will increase their subsidies to the companies. So that will eat part of the tariff. Chances are the company will absorb part of it. And then what would next happen is it won't be that the price will go up to the level that would be the old price plus the tariff, because importers will go to the next lowest supplier. And maybe that's Vietnam, maybe that's Mexico, maybe that's wherever. So this idea that a tariff is a blanket tax on consumers is simply not the way that it works in real life. And it's like a lot of economic theories. It's terrific when you read it in the book, but when you see how it works in reality, it's not the same. Same thing as this myth of free trade. There is no free trade in the world. We are the least protectionist of the major countries by far. And that's been true for a very long time. So it just is misconception after misconception. The theory that there is free trade is so clearly wrong. When we first went to Davos, I was on a panel about trade, and they, of course, were horrified with what we were doing. So after they got through denouncing it, I asked each of them, please tell me, is your country have a higher applied tariff than the US or a lower? Nobody would answer the question because they all knew their applied tariffs were higher than ours, and they had all sorts of non-tariff restrictions. So I think there's a lot of misinformation about tariffs. Will he be tough? Yes. Should he be tough? Yes. And that includes chip. It also includes the export controls on so-called dual-use products that have a commercial use but also a military use. It was me who initiated the CHIPS Act way back in our administration, finally got passed under the Biden administration, and I'm grateful for that. But they took what was a $50 billion request for chip fabrication in this country to overcome our problem that we import the vast majority of all our chips. They took that 50 billion and added 450 billion of items that had nothing to do with chips whatsoever, were just social engineering. Nonetheless, they called the whole thing a CHIPS Act. Well, it was only 10% chips, but I'm grateful they did do that. I think it's intolerable that we have to depend on foreign countries, particularly China, for our semiconductors.
Perhaps one more question before we finish up, Val?
Thank you. Thank you, Baldas from BGD Holdings. Secretary Ross, thank you for your service. A very interesting idea that President Trump duetted when he was at the Economic Club a week or so ago was this idea of putting together a commission to look across the federal bureaucracy for efficiency purposes. Now, you've done a whole lot of restructuring, and then you ran one of the larger federal government agencies, the Commerce Department. Would appreciate your thoughts, having run that. Is the federal bureaucracy, or at least as it pertains to your domain, fit for 21st century?
So the question is really about the nature of the bureaucracy. Is that what your gist is?
And does it have to be upgraded to become
No.
for purpose for 21st
Okay.
century.
Well, I'll tell you a little story about my first encounter with the bureaucracy. The morning after I was confirmed, I went out to the subway stop underneath the Commerce building to greet the workers as they were coming in and become acquainted, and then had a big conference with the senior bureaucrats in the various divisions. And at it, I explained to them the way that I wanted to have them relate to me. And that was, first of all, short memos are far better than long memos. Government people tend to write 100-page, 200-page memos filled with a lot of drivel, and nobody reads them. I said, I don't want a 200-page memo. I want a very brief memo, and I will read it. Second thing, every week you're going to give me a 2-pager on Friday, and the 2-pager will say, what did you accomplish in your group last week? What are you planning to accomplish next week? And what are the longer-term aspirations and problems that you see? Well, the room went totally silent, and finally one of the senior bureaucrats stood up and said, well, Mr. Secretary, it hasn't been our practice to do that kind of reporting. I said, well, it is now, starting Friday. So I spent the whole weekend fly-specking the papers that they sent in, and first thing Monday morning on each of their desks were my comments on their thing. So the conversation at the water cooler was, holy shit, not only wants us to write papers, he reads them. It was a little bit of a wake-up call. But the bureaucracy has in it some very good people, especially in the middle ranks, well qualified, and they would be able to do innovative things if they weren't strangled by the bureaucracy. Because what happens in Washington, unlike private sector, where if you take a risk and you win, you get rewarded. There is no such reward in government. But if you do something out of the ordinary and it doesn't work, the Inspector General comes and rips you apart. The House Investigating Committee comes and rips you apart. So the incentives are to be quiet, calm, do everything the way you always did it. That's the safest thing. So it's the very nature of the bureaucracy is a suffocating thing for people. Having said that, with all the countries I've seen, I haven't seen one that's better run. So I think it comes sort of with the territory of being a big, more or less self-perpetuating bureaucracy.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Let me just say we can only cover a certain amount of material today. I'm sure there's a lot more questions, but I do encourage you all to read the book because there's a lot more detail, a lot of fascinating stories, and I'm sure you'll both enjoy it and learn from it when you do.
Yeah, and I would like to ask you one favor. Please send a like of the book to Amazon, because right now the book is just below Elon Musk's book and Bill Gates' book. And if you will send some likes, it'll encourage people and it will help my personal balance of payments. So.
Well, thank you, Mr. Secretary, and thank you, John. It was exciting to hear the conversation, and also good to conclude with realizing that your competitive instinct is still alive and well as you're competing with Mr. Gates and Mr. Musk. This was a great conversation as part of our book series. We pledge to you that we'll be bringing important authors to you over the course of the year, and it's great that you were all here for this real treat today. Let me just take a second to remind you of kind of what coming attractions, as they say in TV. And on Monday the 16th, we have the chief economist of Boston Consulting Group, Mr. Selzak, with us. He'll be in conversations with our fellow club member, Frank Brozens. We also have on the 17th, a lunch with Michael Strahan, and Terry Lundgren, former chair of the club, will be interviewing him and I'm sure that will be exciting too. We're going to hopefully have other events during the UN General Assembly Week, or UNGA as they call it, and we're also, as we previewed last week, we're in conversations with hopefully the ability to deliver you, our members, Vice President Harris, because we'd love to be able to have a perspective from both sides, and that's clearly what we signed up to do, and it's what we have on our mind. Check your emails and also the website for upcoming events. As always, we want to conclude by saying thanks to the Centennial Club members for what they do to give an underpinning of our club's financial position. We're most appreciative for that. So everyone enjoy your lunch. Thanks again, Mr. Secretary, and congratulations on your book. And everyone, thank you.